In the early 1920s, a technological innovation advanced across the nation: radio. Radio soon became the forerunner of electronic mass communications and opened up a world of entertainment and information that radically changed our nation.
It's bursting into flames. Get it started, get it started. It's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.
Radio created a pattern that influenced other forms of communications, such as modern television and the internet. With the advent of network programming, people from all across the United States shared experiences at the same time, thus tying the nation together under a shared culture.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Radio made our world much smaller. And while modern-day radio may appear to be a far cry from radio of the 20s and 30s, today's broadcasting is heavily influenced by those early experimental days. Early radio in Paducah, Kentucky followed some of the same ebbs and flows as most radio stations. Local citizens created the content in the early days. Programming was delivered with a sense of pride that continues to mark those who live in the Paducah area. Radio announcers became local celebrities. It was inevitable, though, that early Paducah radio would change as the economic advantages of network affiliation emerged, and the competition for advertising dollars increased with newer forms of media. But the first two radio stations in Paducah set a standard for all stations that followed. They learned how to mix radio as a public service with the goal of becoming a thriving commercial enterprise. The sounds of those first stations still echo in the media of today. If you were around Paducah before the 1970s, you probably remember listening to WPAD. From the soaps and comedies of the 30s and 40s to the wacky DJs of the 50s and 60s, many reflect on WPAD when they think of Paducah radio history. Although WPAD is Paducah's oldest surviving radio station, few remember the station that went on the air 8 years before WPAD debuted. WIAR was experimental, short-lived, and dynamic. It helped partly establish how radio would work in Paducah and gave the town a taste of what was to come. The early 1920s in Paducah was a booming time. Paducah was not a northern city, but did not fully identify with the South. This gave Paducah a unique sense of identity that included a taste of the North along with the comforts of Southern hospitality. Industry was on the rise, and the Ohio River provided a strong economic base. Part rural and part urban, Paducah was a town on the grow. Entertainment consisted of the movie theater, local sports, and the skills of local citizens who loved to showcase their talents. At the same time Paducah was growing, the use of radio in the United States was growing too. The big boom of stations did not start until the 1930s, but the early 1920s saw a dotting of broadcast stations across the nation. Until then, many had seen radio as simply wireless telegraph or wireless telephone. Broadcasters were pounding out a design for a radio as a mass communicator.
Well, early 1920s radio was largely experimental. It was very new technology, and it was still still very much in the development phase. It's really kind of fascinating because everything was really new, And no one really knew exactly what was going to work, so they were very willing to experiment.
Paducah entered radio early, and the first station owner was concerned with pure promotion. The Commerce Department issued Kentucky's second radio license to J.A. Rudy & Sons in July 1922. WIAR was a promotional arm of Mr. Rudy's retail establishment. Rudy's was West Kentucky's premier department store. Mr. Rudy was also a master of promotion. He used the local newspaper extensively to advertise store events and sales, and Rudy's window displays became legendary spectacles. Rudy was also the first in Paducah to open an electronics department completely stocked with radio receiving sets. Rudy promoted the sets as a way to listen to his new station, which was conveniently located just a floor above the electronics department.
And there were many commercial enterprises that saw radio as a way to sell their business, not necessarily sell other businesses, commercials, but, a store, a retail store, particularly one that sold radios, could profit from having a radio station.
Much of the content of the station's programming during its early days is now a lost memory due to the station's sporadic transmissions. WIAR operated about half a year before it was sold to the Paducah Evening Sun, a daily newspaper that was owned by Paducah's Paxton family. The newspaper cross-promoted the station heavily beginning in early January 1923. Headlines such as, "Concerts continue to bring praises for Sun Station," "Impressive are music programs by Sun's Radio," and "Artists keep up splendid quality of WIAR concerts were common front page fare." The paper had features about the station and radio in general several times throughout each day's edition. Many articles are very technical in nature. A series appeared on new radio receiving circuits, including detailed instructions on how the reader could build their own set. The series was accompanied with schematics. One article detailed how a Paducah man received a WIAR signal by wrapping a lead pencil in wire, attaching it to a doorknob and a crystal, and then grounding it.
You have a huge group of amateur radio enthusiasts who are reading various publications, Popular Science, Scientific American, and so forth, finding out about this simple radio equipment that you could build a crystal set for next to nothing, building their own radio receivers, and were willing to listen to just about anything just to say that the receiver worked.
The radio station even boasted its ability to beat the weather. A storm hit the city on March 12th, and most telegraph lines were down. The paper's two dedicated AP telegraph lines were inoperable. The paper's headline boasted, "WIAR laughs at elements. Music on time tonight," in a jab to the telegraph industry. "Wires may come and wires may go," the article stated, "but radio laughs at all the efforts of the elements to stop communication between mortals." The local flavor of Paducah radio emerged early. Programming was always live. On January the 9th, 1923, for instance, the paper reported, "Tonight's concert will feature Mrs. Emma Greer Horn of the Palmer Chocolate Shop." Radio broadcasting was truly a community event.
Well, bear in mind that it was all live. There was virtually no recorded material, and the transmission, the control room equipment, didn't really allow you to play back even such things as recorded music on disc and so forth. So if you heard music on the radio, it would be live local performers. And if you heard drama on the radio, it would be live local performers. If you heard news, the news people would be there in the studio. A little bit later on, the mid-1920s, you begin to get network services coming with news coming in on telephone lines, but it's still live.
Programming was from 7 to 8 p.m. Monday through Saturday with an occasional afternoon sports broadcast. Community musicians who regularly made appearances at local events performed in the WIAR studios. Paducah resident Joe Allen, who was known as an expert imitator of animals and birds, presented a program called Kentucky Possum Hunt. The program featured Allen playing every character, including the dogs and the coon. The Sun also asked local residents to notify them when talented friends or family visited from out of town. WIAR was constantly on the lookout for people to sing, play instruments, and perform for listeners. Alvin Barkley, then United States Congressman from Paducah and future Vice President, once broadcast from WIAR, as did Paducah native and humorist Irvin Cobb. Cobb would later go on to perform on network radio, using his unique brand of Southern humor to entertain listeners. The Sun printed portions of listeners' letters in the paper. The national appeal and reach of radio was seen in letters from listeners both nearby and from areas such as Texas, Minnesota, and California. The paper later bragged about letters and telegraphs of praise from as far away as Canada. Radio was not only a local event, it was a national phenomenon. The uniqueness of radio was in the ability of Americans to tune in to a station and grab a slice of life from virtually anywhere in the United States. The programming consisted of local citizens. Therefore, each station had a sound that was exclusive to its region. The power of radio as a national phenomenon, as well as a local one, was then evident. The pride of Paducah was something to be displayed. In March of 1923, Fred G. Newman, author of The Story of Paducah and Paducans in History, presented a program about the city in a type of public relations move to provide the nation with information on that gem and diadem of American cities. The script of the show was reprinted in the Sun. The station reasoned that letters were pouring in from distant locations, and listeners would probably be interested in the city that produced such entertaining programming. But just as listeners from far away were tuning in to hear Paducah stations, some local radio fans were tuning in to hear stations from outside the Paducah area. Radio was a hobby to many, and tracking stations from points afar was entertainment itself.
And again, this is part of the fascination that you could hear things coming from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, and there's some great news stories about national attention being given to such things as finding little lost children, and news stories that we would probably not pay that much attention to today, just because it was the compelling transmission live from location that people would tune into these things and listen to them for hours and hours and hours. So it would be a mostly spoken word. You would have preachers, probably in the early going, very few commercials, because there were certain operations that didn't think that selling things on the air was the right way to use the medium.
At the beginning of March 1923, the station announced it would stop broadcasting on Saturday nights. WIAR, along with other stations in broadcasting range, had agreed to be silent one night a week so listeners could try to receive long-distance signals. While there was support for local programming, this was an indication that local listeners also wanted to hear programs from other areas. The fans of radio came together to form a club in February. Charter members set Edwin J. Paxton, owner of WIAR, as the president, and the club had 130 members within 2 weeks. The club said it represented about 10% of the radio station owners in Paducah. The radio club held meetings at the car barns of the Paducah Railway Company at 14th and Broadway, and would occasionally have control of WIAR during the evening broadcast hour. In March, the club called for people who could moan to the bones to play craps by radio. While the details were sketchy and the call was riddled with the slang of the day, the club made it known that those to the west and north of the station would be appreciative of Southern songs, games, and pastimes, and a real oonce party would create no end of interest. 23 years later, 1946, the Sun reflected on WIAR and the playing of craps on the air. According to the Sun article, 4 men were given $2 in nickels, a pair of dice, and then invited into the studio. After getting over a bit of stage fright, the program was reportedly a riot, and letters came in asking for more programs of its type. In addition to the rich local programming, a sense of service to the community was present from the beginning.
There was also some very altruistic motivation there too. Wanting to provide a public service was very much a part of early radio, and that's something, I don't know if we've completely gotten away from it, but it certainly is not the driving principle of radio today.
The Paducah Radio Club, along with WIAR and the Paducah Evening Sun, started a fundraiser to purchase a radio for Paducah's orphanage, then known as the Home of the Friendless. Radio fans wanted to share the new world of radio with their children and reasoned that the new innovation was meant to instruct as well as entertain. According to one plea in The Sun, possessing a radio set, the children of the home can tune in each day and evening, and the simple process of tuning in will open up to them a new world rich in charm and mystery. The infinite happiness they may attain from such a gift will repay whatever sum may be expended in its purchase, a millionfold. Early in the campaign, the Paducah Exchange Club held a radio broadcasting banquet at the station, a live radio event that boasted 14 acts of entertainment. Children from the home of the friendless listened to the broadcast at the car barns in the rail yard where the radio club held meetings. In addition to providing a radio for orphans, several Paducah businesses and businessmen raised funds to give local firemen a radio for the central station. The firemen had been tinkering with homemade sets, but the new set included an antenna wire that was 100 feet in length and stretched from the fire station to the flagpole on City Hall. Radio was already a community project, and service to citizens was evident. Later, the FCC would seek to regulate a public service commitment aspect of radio, yet those at WIAR started the station with those thoughts in mind. In April, the Sun announced that the station would close for the summer season and end regular evening broadcast until the fall. The paper stated that the studio, which was heavily padded, would be very uncomfortable for performers during the summer months. The Sun indicated that afternoon broadcasts of baseball news would begin and remain throughout the summer. Unfortunately, the station's programming never returned. The 1946 Sun article stated that operations were expensive, and this was at a time when an advertiser-supported model of business had not been established in radio. Earlier radio stations also seemed to lack vision as to where the technology was going.
And I don't think those early educational broadcasters were too terribly well organized. I don't think they really had a plan to say this is what it's going to be like, that would be viable. So I think in many ways the public service broadcasters were kind of their own worst enemies in not advancing a plan there when the commercial interest had a very good plan.
2 or 3 tubes would burn out every day at a cost of $7 apiece. One of the last entertainment performances was fittingly the singing of My Old Kentucky Home. The amazing thing about WIAR was the dynamic way it affected the community in only a 4-month lifespan. Fundraisers were held, a club had been formed, breeders built their own sets, and a daily recruitment of local talent gave listeners across the eastern United States a taste of Paducah. Eventually, the radio industry would find strength in network programming and advertiser dollars. But the early days built within radio a bond between itself and the communities it served. In spite of the Great Depression, radio came back to Paducah in August of 1930 when Pierce Lackey opened WPAD.
And then radio moved up from the cellar to the parlor, its earphones replaced by a handsome cone speaker, big enough for Dad to get his whole head in as he still tried for distance. Maybe Cincinnati Direct on a clear evening.
Lackey was the son of former Paducah mayor and businessman Ernest Lackey.
He had been in the insurance business, had worked for his father, and at an insurance company called Foreman and Lackey. And Mr. Foreman and my grandfather were partners in this. And my father also had been in the Navy, had done a naval stint. So, and he was terrified of water. I don't know how he ever made it in the Navy, but maybe they didn't make him swim in those days. He had the idea about doing this, and he was not a wealthy man, and so he had to solicit funds, and I'm sure that he didn't know all the ins and outs about having to get a license and tower permit and all those kind of technical engineering things, but he went ahead, and an interesting part was that my grandmother had loaned him some money to help put the station on the air, of which he did pay back. But in the early days, $1.50 a day was considered good income for the sponsors that they had. And it was kind of like one of those his mother said they used to, he had run out on payday to start collecting from the sponsors. I have no idea what the sponsors, quote, meant. I assume spot announcements about Slim's Barbecue or Bright's Dress Shop or Rudy's, I guess it was back in those days. But to think about $1.50 being total income, but of course this was during the Depression in 1930. And also Mother said things were so tight that she would go down on Market and get some soup meat and bring it back to the Charleston apartments where they lived. And she would make a pot of vegetable soup and take it over to the Ritz Hotel where the studios were, half a block away. And she would feed the crew that was over there, and the crew, I assume, was the engineer and whatever kind of entertainment they had that day.
By that time, opening a radio station was quite a challenge.
He had to go out to surrounding areas, and I think they said 30 to 50 miles, and consider 1930 and traveling 30 or 50 miles to, I assume that it was the FCC at that time, Federal Communications Commission, was the one requiring it. Evidently it was a government agency anyway. And he had to get signatures and comments from people that they felt a need or a desire for the station.
When the station first opened, the transmitter and antenna were on top of the Ritz Hotel. In a time before gigantic radio towers, the station was able to brag that it could broadcast a full 6 stories above Paducah. Lackey billed the station as the voice of Western Kentucky. Like at WIAR, recorded material was not used on the air in the early days. All programming was live, and Lackey encouraged area residents to sing or play instruments on air.
Whoever dropped in or whoever called and said, I can sing or play the piano or Granddaddy has a banjo.
Adrian Doran, former Kentucky House Speaker and 23-year president of Morehead State University, helped pay his college tuition by singing with the Doran Quartet on WPAD. Paducah native Hoyt Hawkins sang on WPAD in the early 1930s with his family quartet. He went on to join the Jordanaires and realize a long singing career with such icons as Eddie Arnold and Elvis Presley.
I remember when they used to have the live country music. Of course, it wasn't called that then. I don't know what it was called. But they would have live bands in the studio playing on Saturday afternoon. And where the audience sat, there were chairs there. But, it was not that large an area, and people would be jammed in that place to be able to watch these artists with their guitars and singing the country songs. I remember thinking that the W.W. Hawkins quartet group was, that they all looked alike. Mm-hmm. And there's such a similarity between them. But they were very, very popular.
WPAD picked up where WIAR left off with one major addition: advertising support.
Now a radio station, like any other business, must show a profit. To do this and still be able to provide a certain amount of free airtime in the interests of the public, it must sell a major portion of its time to those who wish to advertise. For it must be remembered that advertising is the station's only source of income. It is the salesman who is given the task of creating ideas to sell the advertiser's product. New ideas mean new clients and more money to the station.
WPAD displayed the same community pride that was seen in WIAR. What WPAD did, however, was tie the public service aspect of radio together with commercial success.
I think the radio station was able to draw the community into it, not only on a commercial basis, but to recognize people and the events that were happening in Paducah. And I think that because of that, there was a great deal of pride.
Like WIAR, however, the burden to maintain all live programming was great. The advent of recorded material and amplifiers greatly alleviated the problem.
As a child, I used to go with my father to the post office to get the mail, and then we would go out to 8th Street to the transmitter. I can remember doing this, and I got to play on the typewriter that and listen to the quite large disc that they had. I would get the announcer who was doing something else to set it up in the studio for me so I could listen to some of the programs that would later be aired on. But as I recall, in my child's mind, the discs were this big. I don't think they were much smaller either.
But live programs use only 20% of the station's airtime. The other 80% is broadcast from records, because a recorded program is the easiest to present. It needs only a turntable and a record.
WPAD began using pre-recorded programming such as The Shadow. Even though such programs are widely popular, local programming continued to thrive. It was during this time that WPAD employees began perfecting their craft. Lackey and station employee Gene Peet began on-location remote broadcasts in order to provide better coverage of late-breaking news and events around Paducah.
Man on the street type, I think, is how it really started. And I think, distance was a problem then too. So the station was located at that time at Conner, 4th and Broadway. And Daddy had an old white Buick that the transmitter was put in the back seat, an antenna on the car, and they would do remote broadcast. And how far they could go, I don't know. But I do remember that Ray would do this man on the street and stop and interview people.
Fire downtown. Radio is on hand with its mobile unit. The studio on wheels has enabled radio to be present at practically any news event, from a political speech to a fire like this. The radio reporter broadcasts right from the scene, giving his listeners an on-the-spot account of the fire, the fight to keep it from spreading, the injuries, the damage. When the fire is under control, a first-hand report from the chief.
The ability of WPAD to interact closely with the community was of great importance during the 1937 flood of the Ohio River. This event was a major turning point for WPAD as a service to the community. Stations up and down the river were called upon to relay vital messages in order to save residents trapped by the rising waters.
Flood came along and kind of changed things. Before then, the station had moved out to 8th and Terrell. And when the water started coming up, Daddy and employees dismantled all the equipment and moved it out to my grandfather's garage, which was on Afton Avenue behind Clark School. And then they were only off the air for a few hours and then came back up. And I think it was then that it really was a proving ground for radio and what could be done here in the community. They relayed messages from families. They also broadcast the needs that went out to surrounding areas. And I think the biggest thing was probably the notifications of people being safe or where they were staying, as well as reaching out for supplies.
It was during such natural disasters that radio proved itself as the needed resource.
When the big snowstorm suddenly came through on Thanksgiving Day, and of course the Mayfield Thanksgiving football game was the big event, and when people left home it was like 60 and very warm, I think in short sleeves. And I do remember this, and by that afternoon it was snowing and it was horribly cold. Many people were unprepared. However, when the radio station got news from the Cairo Weather Bureau what to expect, that this storm was moving through, they were on the air and people were saying, "Did you hear on the radio?"
It alerts the people when a storm is approaching, a blizzard, hurricane, or tornado.
It was a very cold, bitter winter day, and as it progressed and night came on, my father was struck by the fact of how nice and warm and cozy he felt, and thinking, looking outside, stepping outside, thinking about the poor people that needed heat, that were without proper clothing or bedding. And he decided it was time to get on the air and raise some funds and some fuel, some coal, and blankets, and he did. And I think this went on for a couple of nights, days and nights, that he was begging for money. People did open up their hearts and give very generously.
Fight against cancer, Red Cross drive, somebody dying and a rare blood is needed, radio to the rescue.
This is an urgent appeal for type AB negative blood.
Radio also acts as your community bulletin board.
This is your KNAB Community Bulletin Board. The Madison Junior High monthly PTA meeting is scheduled for 7:30 tomorrow night. On Saturday, the Lions Club holds its annual picnic at 7 Mile Run. Saturday night, a social at the First Methodist Church on Elm Street. And here's an item worth noting, the annual Fireman's Fair. It begins tonight and runs through Sunday. It's being held in the empty lot just across from the old firehouse. Fire Chief Wilkins announces a number of valuable prizes, including a new car, to holders of the lucky numbers, a chance for fun, and a chance to help a good cause.
Of course, I remember how the weather used to be. The weather news from Cairo would come in. It was on teletype. One day I was at the station and I thought snow was predicted. And so I got on the teletype and I just started typing and I said, how can you predict snow? Well, back came this long sheet, and I think Ray came in and saw it, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I just, as the weatherman at Cairo, how could you tell that it was going to snow? And he said, you know, we pay for this by the minute.
Oh, gosh. Radio as a service to the community became invaluable. At the same time, however, radio became king of entertainment.
It wasn't just a bunch of nerdy boys building, their own crystal radio sets out of a Quaker Oats box and a coil of wire. It really was mainstream America began to adopt the technology of radio.
And now we come to the thrilling final episode of our radio drama. Old Pete Belden, driver of the jitney from Carsonburg to Copper Springs, has a double load today. Pete's ancient bus is carrying the Flying Bee payroll and a passenger, his niece Betty.
Because once you got a radio set, you had free entertainment. And I still think that's a big selling point to radio today. There are very few free forms of entertainment. And again, the investment in a radio set early on was quite substantial. But when the prices began to come down, this one-time investment would give you entertainment, information, certainly propaganda, advertising, political messages and stuff like that, but would give it to you literally anytime you wanted to sit down and turn on the radio. So yeah, radio was actually the low budget entertainment throughout the Great Depression eras, right on through World War II, as opposed to, say, the movies and the recorded music industry, the recorded sound industry, and the book publishing industry, the magazine industry, media where people had to pay to consume every time they wanted to. Radio was a real bargain.
Men, Hicks and his gang have been around this country too long. We're going to clean them out today. But we got to remember that old Pete Belden is with them, and we don't want him to get hurt. All right, boys, let's hit out. Come on, men. We're gaining on them.
They've seen us, Tom.
Right, fellas. They probably have fresh horses at the creek.
Pre-recorded entertainment on discs eventually gave way to network affiliation. Networks allowed stations across the United States to share programming and ease the burden of finding local talent. WPAD became a CBS affiliate in 1943, later than many other stations. But it could not have come at a more crucial time in the history of radio. The affiliation provided the citizens of Western Kentucky valuable information through regular news updates and CBS reporter Edward R. Murrah.
I think people relied so much on the radio for news of the war in Europe, and several personalities, news personalities, just became household names, Edward R. Murrah. And it's, I think that was very crucial. And of course, WPAD's affiliation with CBS was a great big step and a big boost, because they were number one then. I can remember adults sitting and listening. Just would not miss the news for anything. And to hear the live broadcast of, Murrah, and hear the bombs dropping, and then, and of course his description, you felt that you were really there.
World War II made the world a smaller place, and radio played a key role in bringing the gap between the events in Europe and the people of rural Kentucky who sent many of their own to fight. With events such as the 37 flood and World War II, radio grew up. WPAD was not only offered a world of free entertainment, it was a valuable source of information as well. After the war, the networks were thriving.
Arthur Godfrey. Arthur Godfrey, he was a big name then. And the soaps, because they ran from, I think, 12 to 4 or 12 to 3, something like that. And in the morning, Maul Perkins and Guiding Light and Stella Dallas and My Gal Sunday, just to name a few. Helen Trent.
WPAD was mastering the balance between the network programming that was popular with the local programming the community demanded. WPAD, like many radio stations across the nation, offered balanced programming to be all things to all listeners. The days of varied radio formats were still a while away. What would change the radio network relationship forever was a new invention called television.
Well, we still had the network, but of course, one would really be naive and dishonest if not to say that television was a terrific negative factor on radio. And I think, though, that both entities have developed, and they each have their place. It's not, I don't see it in my mind as a real competition, because they both fulfill a need.
Crowds, music, color, and excitement. Who doesn't enjoy a football game? That is, if you're one of the lucky ones who can get in. If you're not, well, it's just too bad. But wait a minute. There may be another answer. Yes, thanks to television, that marvel of modern science, even our unfortunate friend and millions of other people can sit back in the comfort of their own homes and enjoy every thrill of the game.
WPAD thrived in spite of television. The station was saved by what had made it successful up until the debut of TV, the presence of strong local personalities who maintained enduring ties to the community. During the war years, Lackey served as mayor of Paducah like his father. Lackey became a political figure in Western Kentucky, even taking on the role of host and chauffeur in a Paducah parade featuring Adlai Stevenson and Alban Barkley. Gene Peake, WPAD program director and salesman, would also be elected mayor of Paducah. He continued to provide programming for WPAD and created some of the most memorable shows.
I remember Gene Peake and the admiration and respect and following that that man had for his Friendly Philosopher program, as it was called.
Ray Mofield provided a strong voice to WPAD. His role in covering sports led to a position as WPAD's main newsman. His award-winning coverage of President Truman's dedication of Kentucky Dam in 1945 was carried nationwide on the CBS network. He earned his doctorate in broadcasting and taught at Murray State University. Mofield also remained active in radio for the remainder of his life.
Radio helps Mother by advertising the best buys in town.
Today's Best Buy at the Carnet Food Market. Tender chuck roast at 33 cents a pound. At Allen's Shoe Emporium, a gigantic sale on children's shoes. And here's one more special for today.
Radio helps her shop thriftily by keeping her informed of sales.
The role of women in radio reflected the culture of America. Evelyn Stahl worked for WPAD as a host of a ladies' show in the afternoon. Features included homemaking and cooking tips. Stahl's Let's Talk It Over was a program that was billed as newsy, intimate chats with the lady listeners.
Evelyn also was a very talented, I think she was a college graduate, and she was well known for her bubbly personality. She had very good skills, communication skills, and she had a program that was sponsored by Hancock's Grocery Store when it was out on Cairo Road. Evelyn came from Cynthiana, Kentucky, and I don't know how she got to Paducah. I think it was by way of this job, but she was a well-known personality and well thought of.
But as the station moved into the 1950s, the tie with the network had weakened. Radio stations moved into more music programming, and the term disc jockey emerged. It was a local personality who would pull the station into a new era and become Paducah's first disc jockey. Jimmy Youngblood grew up in Cairo, Illinois, and listened to WPAD as a child. It was then he had dreams of becoming a band leader and travel with a big band like the ones he had heard on the radio. He played trumpet professionally and settled in with the Francis Craig Band in Nashville, Tennessee, where the group scored a #1 hit with the song Near You. After Craig left the group in search of a solo career, Youngblood returned to the area and secured a job at WPAD. Youngblood began to define the role of the wacky morning DJ with snappy one-liners, crazy antics, and plenty of sound effects to entertain the audience.
Oh, Jimmy was a real character. Not only being a character, he was very versatile. He had a marvelous sense of humor. He could, had he been videoed, he could have been a one-man show, kind of like a juggling act. He had probably, well, I know he had the largest following of anyone on the air. People kind of set their alarms to wake up with Jimmy in the morning because he was so funny. They would call in and they really felt they had a personal contact with him. He would have a basket, wire basket that would have all of the announcements in it, the live ones, as well as having a yellow sheet inserted that it was going to be an ET, electrical transcription, that he was going to have to play. So in addition to that, Jimmy was also music director, so he'd have his stack of records over here. This was in the days before tapes. And then he would be spinning a record over here, queuing it up. At the same time, he would be reading an announcement. The phone would ring. He would have to remember to turn the copy to make sure. If you could see him, he'd look like a juggler.
Just as Lackey and Peake defined radio in the early days, Youngblood defined it during its changing years. And the change toward music format programming did not stifle the creativity of local programming. In 1961, Jane Blaine, who had grown up at the station and already been employed in several different positions, took on the most ambitious remote broadcast attempted by the station. Her goal, to live a week in a fallout shelter. The civil defense in Washington wanted
these actual scenarios of what would happen if a husband was at work and the wife was left at home with the children. And of course, this was in the days that women weren't working all the time. And how they would react and how they would be able to sustain themselves over the long period of time. And that was the genesis for this experiment. And Mr. Steele, I think his name was Frank Steele, was the civil defense chairman in Paducah. And so he had talked with Daddy about the bomb shelter and being able to utilize it. And so the boys and I did that, and it was quite an experience.
This is a radiological defense operations room, a nerve center for survival, which we hope we will never have to use. But since war could come, this room is ready, and so are others throughout the country.
Rita, Louisville, 740 Zebra, thanks.
5 megaton Paducah.
I took 2 of my boys to the fallout shelter. I think one was 9 and one was 5. It was Jerry Jr. and Joey. And this was during the Cold War, and people were building bomb shelters and being encouraged to do so by the government. And so the boys, my father had built one in his backyard, and it was 10.5 feet underground. I've forgotten how many inches of concrete and etc. Well, anyway, the boys and I were in there for 6 days and 5 nights, I think it was. And we had no contact with the outside, with the exception of the daily radio broadcast. And there were 6 or 8 a day, I think it was. And that part of it was interesting.
An intensive public education program to tell the American people about radioactive fallout and shelter is underway. For it is an informed public that will mean the difference between success and failure in meeting this threat. Informed people in homes and factories and offices must know their personal responsibilities for shelter and protection.
They'd want to know, Jimmy was on in the morning, and I'd come on, I think, a couple of times during his shift. And they'd want to know what we did during the day, how I entertained the boys, and what had happened, and how we ate. We had a little space heater in there, and the 5-year-old said we couldn't make any toast. We had bread, but we didn't have a toaster. And so Joey said, well, Mom, just hold it up against the heater. Well, that's how we toasted bread. Of course, there were sponsors, and I can't remember the name of the grocery store now, but it was at 9th and Broadway. And Daddy and I had gone with my list of groceries. I'd made out what I thought that we needed. And we had 1 single light bulb. I had the telephone, and that's how our broadcast was through the phone. We had I had no refrigeration, so I had to think about cereal, powdered milk. We did have water, not running water, but we had water. We had 2 iron beds that were pushed together. But after about the 4th day, I guess it was, and wait a minute, let me digress a minute. The doctor had given me some liquid tranquilizers that I could give to the boys if I needed it. But I really became depressed. I kept notes, and I had thought, I was told to do this, and I had thought that I would, when I got topside, that I would be able to go through them. He wouldn't let me do that. I had to type them as I wrote it. And it was not always the best English, and certainly the phrasing went, oh, I was just horrified to turn this over to him, but I had to.
At work and at home, everyone must understand the hazards of fallout and the value of shelter. Every family must provide for its own survival for at least 2 weeks. Since radiation levels outside would often be deadly, fallout shelters will protect the most people.
With the passing of Pierce Lackey in 1967, the station was sold outside of the Lackey family. But Pierce Lackey left an indelible mark on radio in western Kentucky. Lackey had started stations all across the west end of the Commonwealth and subsequently turned them over to family members.
He could see the potential and the growth that WPAD had, as well as he had 2 brothers that during this recessional time was, they were very bright, very capable, and as a result, he built the station in Hopkinsville. And his 2 brothers there were working together, one as manager and the other one as sales. And then he opened the 3rd one in Henderson, and so one of the 2 brothers went to Henderson, and then he put Mayfield on the air, WKTM, and then he put, I believe it's WCIF in Madisonville. And those were the 5 that he had, and then the FCC decided that he had a monopoly and would have to divest himself from those. So he ended up and sold the one, each one to the brothers in Hopkinsville and Henderson. And then I'm not sure who it was he sold the one in Mayfield to. But then later he built a station in Anna, Illinois, WRAJ. And at the time of his death, I believe that he had a license or a permit to build a tower and all in Harrisburg. And I know that somewhere along the line he had gotten a permit for Nicholasville, Kentucky. But I know someone else actually ran it and I think bought it. I think she bought it. It was a lady.
And even though WPAD AM eventually fell victim to the rise of FM, Lackey's sense of vision for the power of radio would greatly affect the future of FM radio in Paducah. By 1950, Lackey had erected one of the South's first FM stations. The call letters were simply WPAD FM.
The pilot tuner, which all radios were AM. They weren't made with FM. And if you wanted FM on your radio, if you wanted to be able to hear FM, then you had to purchase what was called a pilot tuner. And it was just a box about like that, and it got only FM on it, but somehow or other it was rigged up to your radio, and that was the way that the first time that you could pick up FM. Well, of course, then it was simulcast. I guess that's a word that you use for radio. And it was all duplication. And then gradually they started splitting for certain things like Cardinal ball game. And that might have really even been the impetus for getting FM, was for the being able to hear the Cardinal baseball games, because they were so popular here.
The FCC would soon ask for a change in the call letters, and WPAD changed to WDDJ. WDDJ remains as one of Paducah's top stations. Even though WPAD is no longer the only station in Paducah as it was for many years, the legacy of it and WIAR can be heard in today's broadcasting. Those who find success in the radio business learn to temper the goal of commercial success with a concern for their role in the community. WIAR and WPAD will continue to live in the legacy they left.
All through the day and every day, your radio is ready to serve you. Wherever you travel, radio is doing its job. It's everywhere. On the farm, in the office, in the barber shop. Indoors and out, at work or at play, radio is always with us in the busiest and the loneliest parts of America. That's the story of radio's service. Service to the family, to the community, to the whole country. From its very birth, radio has been a public servant. It will continue its dedicated service throughout the years to come.
Finds the spot and makes the catch. Dictionary defines cardinals as finches with
AM 1560 WPAD Paducah.
Lord, I'm down, another poor woman down. Lord, I'm down, another poor woman down. I've been having bad luck and trouble since I came to town. Just because I'm from the country,